Welcome into another educational video. This is the International Wine and Food Society Birmingham, Alabama chapter. We're your hosts, Drew and Drew. And if you're tuning in, this is part 2 of a series on fortified wines with sherry and Madeira. So if you've not already done so, look in the videos below. Check out that sherry video first because some of the production methods and techniques and things like that are going to be part of what we discuss and not necessary, but would be better if you had an understanding of that before we start talking about what we are going to start now, which is one of my absolute favorite categories of wine, and one that I'm hoping that we can educate people on and turn them on to some things maybe they haven't had yet. But this is the just almost beyond scientific, beyond explanation category that is known as Madeira. And to touch on it briefly before Drew's going to give us a bit of a historic view and see kind of its significance and why it became so popular in the Americas. But the thing that fascinates me about this is that in and of itself, Madeira, the wine is already destroyed. The wine is fully ruined and oxidized, which a lot of times those words have a negative connotation with them and turn people off. But once you understand a little bit more about that production method, which again Drew is going to explain to us here in just a second, you'll see why that creates something that is almost beyond understanding and logic in the wine world, and truly an incredible category that has, if you want to talk about wines that are ageless and timeless and just have longevity that'll far outlive any of us walking planet Earth right now, then Madeira is a fantastic category, and one that I think doesn't get the credit it deserves anymore, because I think that as other alcohol production picked up in the Americas, in the colonies, and in the early years of the United States, as we encountered westward expansion and came into grain sources, and we saw whiskey becoming a pretty big thing, and the cider industry was growing, the brandy industry was growing. Some of these categories like sherry and Madeira kind of got lost into the annals of history, and only now do we have the opportunity to kind of rediscover these historic wines and these historic categories, partly thanks to some of the hard work from some companies like that we're going to taste today from Rare Wine Company, called the Historic Series, or the Historic Madeira Series. So if you don't mind, I'm going to give you a tall order here. Tell us about Madeira production and how it's made, and then we're going to kind of walk through 3 different styles, and we'll touch on why these wines from the Historic Madeira series have the names they do, and what that means specifically with their unique production methods.
Well, let's talk about the history again real quick, because he touched on it very well, and it's similar to what we talked about in sherry. The golden age for this type of wine was in the 1500s, the age of exploration, up until the 17 and 1800s, where the Americas really came into play. Just like champagne and some other styles of making wine, it's like the happy accident that mankind found, right?
Right.
So they were shipping wines across the seas for a while. A lot of it would get there spoiled. And then all of a sudden, they found that in the cargo holds of these big wooden vessels that were going to the Americas, the combination of those barrels jostling in the cargo hold, basically, as well as the heat, extreme heat in those wooden ships, led to super oxidative, heated wines that, when they opened them up, were completely incapable of spoiling and tasted good.
They'd already been ruined.
Ruined, right. And turned out they were better ruined than they were fresh. Right. So it's one of those happy accidents where they're like, oh, okay, great. So now, and we'll get to this a little bit in the production method, but now that's artificially done. But in the time, it was fresh juice taking months to get across the ocean, and it would come out perfect when it got to the colonies, right? Happy accident. So the island of Madeira, which is where these are coming from, hence the name, is a Portuguese-owned island off of the coast of the northwest tip of Africa. It is closer to Africa than it is to Portugal. Part of the reasoning behind it was also a great way station, basically, for the Portuguese Empire. not only to hit some of their colonies in Africa, but also coming out of the Mediterranean as a good stopping point to have, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern products that they had cultivated. Stop there, get refueled, get more supplies, and then go on to the Americas. So a great way station. What had happened and why Madeira kind of fell out of popularity for a while was a combination of different things. Economy, the fall of the Portuguese Empire, the fact that Madeira got heavily infected by phylloxera, and so it took time for them to get back on their feet, and the general tasting profiles can change. Another thing is port became a lot more popular as well, mainly due to the fact that the port industry was vastly controlled by the British Empire compared to the Portuguese Empire. So again, going to the production method is a little bit less complex as far as the aging process goes compared to sherry. There's not that Solera system. It is, wine that is a base wine, fortified, and then undergoes incredible heat and kind of oxidative aging. That's done artificially now. We're not obviously sending long haul boats, made of wood across the oceans. But how they do it is sometimes different depending on the small boutique style of making Madeira, or a little bit more the mass produced. There's not a whole lot of Madeira produced, so don't think like mass production like port even. But Madeira is a relatively small island still. The other difference is with sherry, we talked about the two main grapes being Palomino and Pedro Jimenez. There are multiple different varietals that you can use to make Madeira, but really 5, with 4 being of the quality ones. We're going to try 2 of those here, but they are Cercial, Verdejo, Boal, and Malmsey. Those are the 4 kind of noble grapes that you use to make Madeira, and in that order is the dryness to sweetness levels. The other grape that you will see is called Negre Mole, which is a Madeira grape that is used to make it's kind of the fill-in, right? It's the bulk grape that they can use to make some Negro Mole 100%, but sometimes there's a little bit of a blend.
Okay.
It's a darker style, it's a sweeter thing, so it kind of uses, kind of filled into...
so like almost for like roundness and texture and body more than anything else?
Exactly. So the first one we're starting off with is the Cercial. And as Drew had mentioned, we're using all wines from the Rare Historic series from Rare Wine Company, a great importer that we deal with here in the state of Alabama. And in this series, they have taken each varietal, so this is 100% Cercial, and each varietal they have given a city of the United States name. All of these cities are traditional and historic ports in the U.S. where you would have seen Madeira be a major commodity that was traded and brought in. So for this one, for the Cercial, they have named it after Charleston, South Carolina. This is the driest of the styles that we get from them. What you're getting here is, compared to, say, the bone dryness that we had with the Manzanilla and the Fino of sherry, this has already got that oxidative age. You got the amber color. A little bit more reminiscent to the Amontillado that we tried.
Yeah, that is the parallel.
Fruit, a little bit more fruit. It's not as dry as the Amontillado. There's a little more of candied apples and candied oranges compared to, say, like dehydrated, dried oranges.
Yeah, I'm almost getting like a discernible and almost at the forefront like a brulee characteristic. Like
Absolutely.
All those fruits have been bruleed or roasted in the oven with a little sugar on them.
Right, exactly. Still at this level and with this dryness, this is the parent, right? Yes, we could do some creme brulee. I think you're right there, but as a food pairing. But this is really salted cheeses, olives, some charcuterie, and really just as a sipping wine. The one thing that's majorly different compared to sherry is this has undergone more heat and more oxidative aging. So, whereas even with those sherries that are kind of at the higher end of the alcohol range, you're going to be fine to like have those open for 6 months, maybe even a year in some cases. Madeira, at any stage, once you open it up, it will never go bad. And I mean that. Like, you can open this bottle right now, and in 50 years, open this bottle back up, and it is going to taste the exact same as it does today.
If somebody, is there a rule that people have to follow? Like, do they have to store it in the fridge? Can they just leave it on the counter? Should they keep it in a cellar? Like, what are we talking here?
The contact that we have with Murray Wine Company, and unfortunately his name is escaping me right now, that we deal with, one thing I remember about the talk that he gave me about this is he has bottles all over his house that he has randomly opened from time to time, and now instead of like us having a candle on the shelf or some books on the shelf, he has open bottles of Madeira on the shelf. And he'll go back and go, oh, 1964, cool, and try it. And it's not in a refrigerator, it is not in any kind of temperature-controlled cellar, it is just around the house. You cannot damage this wine anymore.
That's fascinating.
It can sit in the windowsill and be fine. Now, yeah, I put a chill on it before I tried it because it might be warm, but the flavor profile is not going to change.
That is absolutely, that's what I'm talking about. Like, that in and of itself defies any and all logic that we know to be true with really any other alcoholic beverage, including some spirits. Now, that does beg a question. Do we see will you have natural evaporative loss?
I mean, if it's open, yes, maybe a little bit, yeah, for sure. But
I mean, if you're corking up, you'd have good to go.
You'd have to be really watching the par levels to really notice anything. The other thing I would say is, very much like when you put a scotch or a whiskey in a carafe or anything like that, you're not going to lose a whole lot there. And if it's open to air, again, other than some slight evaporation, you're not going to change the nature of that wine. The next one we're trying is a grape called Bual, B-U-A-L. They labeled this one as the Boston Bual. Obviously, Boston was a major harbor during the 1700s and 1800s, and would explain the rise. I mean, if anybody's a history buff, there are countless times of Thomas Jefferson and a lot of the other founding fathers ending the day after arguing at the halls of Congress, having a glass of Madeira. It's just what you did. Again, it wasn't even a sign of the elite. Madeira was available to a lot of people. Yes, people who could normally drink anything else than locally made beer usually were the more wealthy of the U.S. People, but it wasn't like a snooty thing as well. It was pretty much what you saw in a lot of the traditional bars and taverns. So,
and one thing that's interesting to me as well about that is that, you speak of some of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson himself, Patrick Henry, like a lot of these guys, they had a thriving side business that was not so on the books according to the British Empire before the American Revolution. They were smuggling. They were getting around taxes, and a lot of it, especially in ports like Boston and New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston. I mean, they were smuggling Madeira. It was a thriving empire that brought a lot of wealth, and quite honestly, continued to fund the American colonies. Certainly funded a lot of the aspects of the American Revolution, but continued to fuel the economy long after that as well.
Some of the oldest bottles that have been up at auction at Christie's or elsewhere are bottles of not only Bordeaux, but Madeira, sherry, port, that were labeled TJ for Thomas Jefferson, that were private orders that came across the United States, and they were only designated for one person. So,
and to put that into perspective, a lot of times when those guys, those founding fathers, were ordering, placing orders, of Madeira and sherries and things like that, they were not ordering bottles or even a couple of cases. These guys were special ordering
boatloads,
pallets, literally boatloads of sherry and Madeira, and in particular Madeira, to come across. Yeah. And one thing that's circulated around was the actual bar tab after kind of the signing of the Declaration, or was it maybe it was after the Revolution. I believe it was after the Revolutionary War, or it could have been the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but it was something to the tune of 52 founding fathers were there, and they consumed, with a long list of other things, over 56 bottles of Madeira, something to the, it was gallons upon or liters at the time, liters upon liters of beer, wine, champagne, but the number one product consumed, Madeira, and it was over one bottle per attendee.
So the last style we're going to talk about for Madeira is kind of a drier style, and it's one that's it's a little gray as far as where the history comes on this. So this is what they call a rainwater style of Madeira. There's legends that a barrel was left out in the rain on a beach, and that's where it gets its name. There's a person who apparently imported a lot into the United States, and his last name was Rainwater, and they say that, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because the term was used before then. But basically, it is made mostly out of Verdejo grape. A little bit of Negro Mole is in there as well. It is made in a drier style, and is unfortunately in the 1780s 18 and 1900s, it was actually considered the premier or the very best way of making Madeira. Somehow in the 20th century, it kind of got bastardized to meaning like a very low production way of making Madeira, a little bit drier, a little bit, it's not one of the noble grapes per se by itself. And so it kind of got relegated to a secondary category. Good news is if you want a drier style of Madeira, perfect to get a rainwater. Also, typically a little bit less expensive than, say, a more noble grape style.
Yeah, and that drier aspect to me makes this one a little bit more of that pairing with cured meat, salty cheeses, the olives.
There's still some fruit there, though. It's not like the bone dryness of the sherry. So
right.
Don't think that this and the Pinot are going to be on par with each other. There's a little bit of richness to it.
And one of the stories that I heard about rainwater Madeira that I actually think is probably the most correct was they used to store, because remember, I mean, Madeira was being consumed at every tavern, every pub across the colonies, and they would have to buy so much of it. The establishment would. They didn't have room for it down in the basement or behind the bar, so a lot of times they would keep the barrels out back. And the most accepted theory is that those barrels would get topped off with rainwater. You know, so those barrels would basically end up being almost not a watered down version of Madeira, right, but certainly one that became equally as popular because it's a little bit lower alcohol, a little bit drier. That the sweetness isn't quite as high again because it's, you know, again it doesn't feel like it's watered down. But you know that's one of the most predominant theories for production and where the name came from.
But same thing, it will last forever once you open it up. There's no risk, you know, as far as it being, you know, a lesser value or anything like that. But definitely one that you'll see out there. This one is called the Baltimore Rainwater from Historic. And again, it's a little bit cheaper. These are all going to kind of retail in the $50 to $60 range. So they are a little bit of a higher price point than a lot of the sherries we talked about in the last video. But again, price per ounce for the decades that you can have this bottle if you really, you know, want to have it that long. I think the value is great.
If you can keep your hands off of it once you get it into your house, it is absolutely just stunning how long these bottles will last. Again, and will outlive all of us pretty comfortably and pretty easily. So the thing that I think is fun is that I've got several friends that actually buy, you know, they'll buy a bottle of Madeira the year that their kid was born or something like that.
Totally.
You know, or buy it the year they get married, and, you know, and they'll hang on to it for a kid's 21st birthday, kid's 30th birthday, you know, 50th wedding anniversary. I mean, they just don't go bad.
Yeah,
and that's crazy. And because of a lot of the other processes that are involved, we really don't see issues like you would have. There's never a question. You know, sometimes you can buy a super expensive, you know, single vineyard wine or whatever, and you run the risk of, you know, did I wait too long to open it? That's never going to be a question with something like this. So, again, an amazing category that hopefully you've gotten excited about, and seek these out. There are a ton of great Madeiras out there. These are just some of the ones that we showed today because they've got a pretty distinct profile for each one of the historic series. And again, that's pretty fun to think that right now you're drinking something that would have been consumed in Baltimore. And again, because it's timeless, we can safely say that we are drinking something that tastes the same as what the founding fathers would have been drinking in Philadelphia, in Charleston, in Baltimore, in Boston, New York, all these places. And that's just something that very rarely do you have the opportunity to say that and experience that. So it's a fascinating category, and one that hopefully we hope that you take the time to go find one, seek it out, take it home, enjoy it.
And both with sherry and Madeira, again, we've kind of done the broad strokes. There's a lot more information you can find online. There's a lot more information you can just get by, you know, trying different producers and kind of looking into it. But, you know, hopefully this will kind of open your eyes to another category that you might not have explored.
And don't forget, below the video, there's a subscribe button. Give us a like, hit the subscribe button, and feel free to comment. If you've got something that you'd like to see us cover, a category, a style, or anything like that, leave it in the comments. We would love to get that into consideration and get that in the on the docket of videos to do. So, from Drew and the International Wine and Food Society Birmingham, Alabama chapter, thank you. Cheers.